Hi, so welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, in fact, and welcome to this session of the Contemporary Artists Book Conference. I am Nicholas Koblenz, and as you know, this is Karina Reynolds, and we are members of the organizing committee of the conference and will act as hosts for this session. The CABC has held this conference since 2008. And this year is organized by the Center for Book Arts as part of the Printed Matter Virtual Book Fair. We'd like to thank the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts, for their generous support of the Center for Book Art Criticism initiative and in making the conference possible. Additional thanks to the conference sponsors, Brooklyn Rail, Sorted Library, and Small Editions. The Center for Book Arts and the usual in-person space for of the Contemporary Artist Book Conference are on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape peoples. I ask you to join me in acknowledging and uplifting the Munsee Lenape community, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations in the lands in which you are tuning in from. There are 10 sessions overall between Friday and Sunday, exploring a wide range of questions about artists' book criticism, what it is now and what it can be, and a link to the CABC program is posted in the chat window. These sessions include two convenings as part of the Book Art Review initiative to help develop principles for the future of book art criticism, and a closing plenary in which we will look to collect actionable ideas and recommendations that arise throughout the conference. These items will be posted on the CBA website with progress reported during the coming year and next year's edition of the conference. In addition to the Zoom meeting, sessions will also be live streamed on the CBA YouTube channel and will be recorded and posted after the conference. If you have questions during the session, please post them in the chat session, and as hosts, we'll be asking them on behalf to the panelists. Attendees will be muted throughout, and we recommend you also keep your cameras turned off. Please feel free to chat during the session and remain respectful of the speakers and other attendees. We'll also be posting relevant links during the talks. If you need any assistance during the session, please send a private message to anyone with CABC in their name. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today, Paul Soulellis. Hi, Paul.
Hello. Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Nicholas. I'm just going to get started and share my screen and get into it. Can you all see okay?
Yes.
Great. So I want to start by just, of course, thanking the Center for Book Arts and for this event and for including me in this event, as well as Karina Reynolds, the executive director, and the entire staff for making everything run so smoothly, and Printed Matter, of course, for the entire fair. I'm gonna get started. You'll see on many of my slides, I've got a little QR code at the bottom. That's if there's a link to something that I'm referring to in the slide. And then I believe at some point, Karina will also post, maybe towards the end, a link to the actual talk itself and all the slides. So I'm going to go fairly quickly. So, I mean, the images will go by quickly. So if you want to refer to things later, you'll have access to all the imagery. I'm also really excited to continue the conversation that was started in the classroom session a few hours ago with Hardworking Good Looking and Clara and Dante and Christian, and others. It was an amazing conversation about urgent publishing and the aesthetics of urgency. And I felt like I was really happy to think about that conversation perhaps continuing in this session. So I'm going to get started. This is a work in progress, as talks like this tend to be. So I'm really looking forward to the feedback and the discussion afterwards. So we're here at this conference devoted to the artist's book. at an enormous art book fair, that is considered to be the ultimate destination for artists who publish. And we're here to take the temperature, so to speak, as the title of this event tells us, around art book criticism and scholarship. We're taking the temperature during a pandemic, during the radical turbulence of racial injustice, police brutality, political turmoil, and climate emergency, a feverish backdrop to the task at hand. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging that for the next 40 minutes or so of this talk, I'm going to present within this very specific, very real context of multiple overlapping and intersecting crises. I want to begin with one of the more foundational statements about artistic publishing, written in 1976, which was the same year Printed Matter was founded. It's from writer and curator Lucy Lippard, one of its co-founders, and it appeared in this issue of Art Right, with Carl Andre on the cover, a periodical that was founded and edited by some of her Printed Matter colleagues. In this statement, which appears in context with many other statements about artists' books, she expresses optimism around the politics of publishing as an artistic practice. She's writing about the potential for artists' books to act like propaganda, specifically around feminism. She says, quote, "One of the reasons artists' books are important to me is their value as a means of spreading information. I'm talking about communication, but I guess I'm also talking about propaganda. Artists' books spread the word, whatever that word may be. So far, the content of most of them hasn't caught up to the accessibility of the form. The next step is to get the books out into the supermarkets, where they'll be browsed by women who wouldn't darken the door of Printed Matter or read heresies, and usually have to depend on Hallmark for their gifts. I have this vision of feminist artists' books in school libraries or being passed around under the desks, in hairdressers, in gynecologists' waiting rooms, in Girl Scout cookies," end quote. So almost 50 years later, I think we can say that Lucy Lippard's vision of artists' books ensconced in supermarkets has finally arrived, although not in the form she anticipated. Today, rather than finding heresies at the Stop and Shop, we download it and we carry it around with us while running our errands. We find artists getting the word out about feminism and race and politics there in our feeds. But this works so well, not because the zines are for sale, but because we are. We are the product, or rather our behavior and data are. Lippard's vision has been turned inside out. Instead of artists taking over public space with publishing, we have algorithmically sorted feeds acting like vast publishing machines that engulf us, watch us, and listen in while we post, shop, and consume. And of course, there's no need to actually go to the supermarket. We can do that right there in the feed. Who controls the narrative then in this distorted version of the empowered artist who has so-called free access to these unlimited tools? These feeds that we care for and nurture and consume are precisely engineered by big tech companies to manipulate our attention, while at the same time claiming that their publishing platforms have finally democratized the dissemination of information, LOL. We know this isn't true, and that these tools are far from perfect, far from pure. Yet still, we fight to protect and consume and occupy them. It really is a surreal thing to think about this inside-out, disembodied version of Lucy Lippard's dream of spreading the artistic word. I'm also thinking about Lippard's famous quote in relation to urgent publishing, because there is an undeniable sense of urgency right there in her language. She's expressing the political potential for artistic publishing, art as propaganda, publishing as a way to shift or change perspective. There is some truth to this in our current reality, which complicates my simplified read of big tech publishing. Artists are pushing art to the masses like propaganda, but they're doing it alongside everyone else and their messages, including, and perhaps especially, her Hallmark moms. Her awkward characterization of those women who wouldn't, quote, darken the door of printed matter sounds off or even offensive today. And for me, it brings up questions about Lepard's own position in writing her statement around questions around class, race, and feminism in the mid-1970s. Lepard's statement and our connection to her through this fair, however, sets the stage for us to take the temperature today. She dreamed of a politicized, maybe radicalized publishing future through artistic means. But publishing has always been political, artistic, academic, commercial, or otherwise. Publishing compels, persuades, informs, attracts, confuses, scripts, and manipulates. To publish is fundamentally a political act. In moments of crisis, as we've experienced so deeply in the last year, we see not only artists, but community organizers, scholars, poets, activists, collectively engaging with different modes of publishing to urgently document and communicate what's happening in real time. They're not at the supermarket, they're in the street, and they're at home with us. Today, the artist's propaganda that Lepard hoped for is right there in our feeds when we wake up in the morning, making the distinction between what is or isn't right for us, or radical enough, or too political, or not artistic enough, or what is or isn't publishing even, an overwhelming condition and much more difficult to navigate. Here's an artist's book by Lawrence Weiner, solidly regarded within the artistic publishing canon, and whose work has been featured at Printed Matter since the day it opened. Here's his most recent work, a collaboration with Virgil Abloh for Louis Vuitton. For their fall-winter 2021 collection, they, quote, plastered his statements across accessories, which we can see in these stills from a highly stylized film that was released online just a few weeks ago to introduce the work. Dramaturgy and scenography is credited to Candace Williams of Cassandra Press, one of the exhibitors here at the fair. They are just part of a vast team of highly creative and sought after artists, poets, musicians, and cultural producers coming together to sell $4,000 bags. How do we approach artistic publishing now in relation to a project like this, in relation to this economic reality? How do we reconcile the artist, the propaganda, and the supermarket here? I'm purposefully creating some confusion with this example here in order to question some of the terms we're using at this conference, like artist's book, artistic publishing, and publishing as artistic practice. I'm well aware of where this language comes from and what it means in a classic sense. But rather than control and cement these terms into a kind of self-reassuring certainty, I think it's crucial that we problematize this language and these images. Especially here at this conference, at this fair, who gets to use the word artist? What qualifies as artistic publishing when this kind of commercial and cultural production is the context that we're working in? Selling $250 photo books, or in this case, $14,000 artists' portfolios, or tabling next to a $10.5 billion corporation at the art book fair. Why look at artists' books at all right now in crisis? Like the rest of the art world, artists' books have been absorbed into every corner of corporate, commercial, and institutional politics. A. Bronson noted this in an interview in 2015 and talks about an interest in things that are done less institutionally, on the fly. Quote, artists are using different technologies. Books like this can occur and be printed in a more casual way, my emphasis. I propose that we examine this more casual way of publishing, stretching beyond books and beyond the artist's practice even, and open up this space to a broader understanding of how folks shift our view by disseminating urgent creative material. Writing about queer publishing in this context of cultural capitalism and institutionalization, Darian Razdar says that, quote, subsuming radical practices into dominant structures perpetuates more harm than it reduces. Nonprofits, museums, cultural corporations, style magazines, chic developers, and governmental arts councils are all complicit to varying degrees in the exploitation of transgressive art for capital accumulation. That entire essay that Darian wrote is fantastic. The link is there. Instead of focusing on these institutions and the exceptional artist publisher as solo producer, let's think about publishing below, outside of, against, or after capitalism, and acknowledge the complex reality of how it is that artists who make books are even able to survive today under enormous precarity. Publishing has always been used to dominate and exert control as one of the principal tools of hegemonic power and colonization. Treaties, tracts, maps, executive orders, regulations, laws, textbooks, branding guidelines, entire libraries, algorithmic feeds. These are just some of the ways in which the construction and distribution of knowledge through acts of printing, publishing, and archiving have been used to control the narrative. And in so doing, to marginalize, authorize, police, harm, and erase, especially in today's special blend of accelerated surveillance capitalism. So there's good reason to try to understand the political potential of publishing right now, especially when it can be used to loosen or push back against the grip of hegemonic power. Because while publishing can most certainly be a tool of the oppressor, the ability to circulate stories and information in public space is also one of the superpowers of the underserved. As a means towards the empowerment of those who suffer most under oppression, independent publishing enables truly alternative ideas to be seen and heard outside of corporate, state, and institutional settings. Sometimes it's happening right there in the open on the same exact platforms where others are doing the most harm. Sometimes it's elsewhere in less visible spaces. So while we're here to think through and examine and question the form of the book, I would like to suggest that we also put that safe word aside and instead think platform. With so many ways to make public and an endless range of publishing technologies and platforms becoming available, publishing as empowerment is now more possible than ever. But I'm going to have to leave the artist's book behind to go further with this thought. Which brings me to the title of my talk, Urgent Publishing After the Artist's Book. The radical potential of publishing, artistic or otherwise, is the part of Lepard's quote that I'm most hopeful about. How we might share stories, legitimize thought, propose alternatives, and collectively imagine other futures by, with, and for oppressed communities, especially Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer and trans folks, disabled folks, immigrants, and everyone else left out of normative history writing and speculative future visioning. From live streaming to Animal Crossing protests to community organizing on Discord, today's independent publishing culture enables those with access to basic tools so many options for creatively disseminating radical ideas. And to use the circulation of published material as a way to gather in communion against oppression. This happens at every scale, from individual empowerment to global coalition building. Urgent radical publishing is one of our most powerful tools in the movement towards liberation. Yes, let's leave the traditional form of the artist's book aside for now. Instead, we'll draw upon decades of radical anti-capitalist thought and collective action, focusing on specific moments of publishing as interference, produced within the Black radical tradition, feminism, abolition, cooperative organizing, queer and trans liberation, and queer theory. This other history of publishing is sometimes approached through an art or design or poetry lens, but it's almost never the primary focus when telling that story. By looking closely at the interference and at the specific gestures and acts of publishing that interrupt and agitate, I want to shift our attention away from the commodified supermarket view of publishing as the production of objects. What if the famous fruit salad diagram by Clive Philpott had been drawn to depict actions or gestures rather than consumable pieces of fruit? Looking closely at specific acts of radical publishing as interference enables us to see the labor involved and the values that emerge from social publishing ecosystems that depend upon collaboration, participation, communal care, and mutual aid networks. Values that encompass a new ethics and a politics of making public rather than endless variations on old publishing models. Let's look at a few examples. Much has been written and discussed about the visual impact of the Black Panther newspaper and Emory Douglas's amazing legacy as the party's Minister of Culture and the newspaper's art director, designer, and main illustrator, as well as the political content published in the more than 500 issues of the newspaper, which was the most widely read Black newspaper in the US in the early 70s. How the newspaper was distributed is less discussed. Wednesday night was when the paper came out. Every Panther in the Bay Area came to help get the paper out. Black Panther Party members themselves were responsible for dispersing the news and would sell the paper in laundromats, street corners, and other public spaces. Sounds familiar. This is the radical publishing future Lucy Lepard dreamed of, but years before she wrote those words. The cost of the paper was 25 cents, and sellers would keep a dime from each sale. As a cooperative model of publishing, the dissemination of radical thought was closely dependent upon each member's participation as a distribution point in a peer-to-peer network. I propose that we see the Black Panther newspaper model as an early example of urgent mutual aid publishing. It's the radical labor here that's often overlooked in favor of the end product. Participation in the Black Panther publishing ecosystem was supported by the act of delivering it. Each distribution point also becomes an opportunity for conversation, to learn, interact, and engage between people. As a shared practice, the Black Panther newspaper was not just a published product, but an alternative publishing economy that prioritized care and community need. And this was negotiated and fulfilled communally through acts of mutual aid. The exchange of money enabled the newspaper to continue printing, but it also directly benefited those who labored in its distribution. The act of publishing itself was intimately tied up in the values and politics of its content. The form was conventional, it's a newspaper, but every other aspect challenged expectations, from its politics to its design, to its method of delivery, to its economic model, to its social impact. It was urgent publishing in the physical timeliness of its delivery in public space, and in the necessity to gather and exchange in the exact moment of exchange. This was radical publishing because it interfered with the conventions of white-controlled, white supremacist mainstream media by amplifying the conversation around racial injustice. It gave voice to Black communities in crisis. Later in the 70s, the Kombahi River Collective emerged in Boston. The collective was a Black feminist lesbian organization, and it published what would become a groundbreaking text, the Kombahi River Collective, a Black feminist statement. The statement announced their politics as separate from and more radical than the group they emerged from, the National Black Feminist Organization. Barbara Smith was one of the co-founders of the collective, as well as of Kitchen Table, Women of Color Press later on. In an incredibly detailed oral history in 2003, she describes the formation of the group and the writing of the statement. She said, "And people know about the Kombahi River Collective because of the statement and because I was committed, even before becoming a publisher, to have that appear in as many places as possible around the country and the world." Later in the interview, Smith describes making photocopies of the text after it was published for the first time in this book in order to distribute it at a conference. It was going, quote, "It was going to that conference and coming prepared with copies of the collective statement that we had Xeroxed. That's what gave me the idea to do the Kitchen Table Women of Color Press Freedom Organizing Pamphlet series." Smith's photocopying of the radical text and delivering it in person, coming prepared to a new audience, was both casual and urgent, and probably didn't look or feel like publishing in the moment, but it was a necessary and timely act of dissemination. She speaks of preparation, of readiness to spread the word with the statement, photocopies in hand. It was an urgent intervention within the time and space of the conference, more a quick gesture than formal publishing. But without question, the distribution of a radical text. She used modest available tools, a Xerox machine, and her own labor to spread the word. It was a timely redistribution, a quick republishing on top of a slower one, entirely outside the academic, commercial, or alternative publishing worlds. She did what had to be done. It was around that time that Smith founded Kitchen Table Women of Color Press after a phone conversation with Audre Lorde in October 1980, where Lorde said to her, "You know, Barbara, we really need to do something about publishing." Smith goes on to say, quote, "As feminist and lesbian of color writers, we knew that we had no options for getting published, except at the mercy or whim of others, whether in the context of alternative or commercial publishing, since both are white dominated," end quote. From the urgent need to write and publish the Kombahi statement, to the Xeroxing and hand delivery to new audiences, to the necessity of starting a press that would work towards a new Black feminist publishing, the extended moment described by Smith suggests enormous labor and determination. These acts and artifacts are the result of a powerful commitment to communal care through the distribution of radical ideas. Along with the Black Panther newspaper and Kitchen Table, many other activist publishers emerged from crisis, resistance, and liberation in the late 60s and into the 90s, from Freddie and Lorraine Perlman and their Black and Red Press at the Detroit Printing Co-op, to the early queer publishing collective Community Press in New York City in the 70s, with incredible taglines like "Survival by Sharing" and "Press for a Sharing Culture," to Grand Fury and Act Up, Queer Nation, and the queer and trans zines and newsletters of the 80s and 90s, like Gender Trash. I'd like to bring one more moment into this timeline. It's an image that attracted wide attention in the context of the AIDS pandemic and the necropolitics of the Reagan administration in the US, which targeted gay men and intravenous drug users. In October 1988, artist David Wojnarowicz attended an ACT UP action at the FDA in Washington, D.C., wearing a denim jacket with lettering that spelled out the following message on his back: "If I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA." I see this jacket, as well as this photograph of Wojnarowicz wearing it, first as an act of protest. It speaks within and on behalf of the collective, the ACT UP activists assembled at this particular moment, and the vast community that they represented. It speaks as an urgent gesture of publishing, manifesting dire language in public space. The wearing of the jacket uses the very body that is the subject of its message, the body that will die 4 years later from this disease, as the platform for its dispersion. This jacket is many things. It's a performance, it's graphic design, it's a shared plea, it's a political protest. It's an urgent artifact charged with meaning and power in the specific context for which it was created. It exists as a fleeting performance in that moment, an urgent message that announces a call for refusal, forget burial, and the potential for radical action, just drop my body. It continues to deliver these messages as a specific photograph that documents the event, circulating more than 30 years into the future and speaking to us today in relation to other pandemics. It's the artist's labor that needs to be noted here, an urgent call to interfere against acceptance and cooperation. As we trace an incomplete history of urgent acts of publishing, I propose that we identify the labor surrounding this jacket created and worn at this protest, and the photograph that recorded it, now traveling through time and across networks as a powerful example of publishing's radical potential to interfere with and loosen power. It does so defiantly, outside of any commercial model, outside the supermarket, standing far away from capitalist heteronormative definitions of artistic success. The Black Panther newspaper spreading the word, Barbara Smith spreading the word, David Wojnarowicz spreading the word. We should resist seeing these moments of interference as singular, disconnected events in the history of independent publishing. Instead, let's consider them as one extended moment of urgent formation, a formation that connects those acts to each other and to many other acts and gestures in an ongoing liberatory movement, a movement that expands into our present and beyond, spreading the word. This is a different history of artists getting the word out as propaganda and as interference, far away from Ed Ruscha, Soulellis, Seth Siegelab, and the printed matter origin story. Antifa, abolitionist, anarchist, activist, queer, mutual aid, and other types of liberatory publishing made by artists and non-artists alike continue this extended moment of urgent formation today, moving it towards a queer, never arriving utopian horizon. This extended moment produces artifacts that might seem unremarkable in form, but the photocopies, PDFs, spreadsheets, tweets, GIFs, memes, zines, banners, flyers, and pamphlets are only a part of the story. We must also understand the enormous labor and risk involved in their making, in their collective sharing, and in their ability to agitate. This is urgent publishing that's local, peer-to-peer, and decentralized, whether for an audience of 5 or 5,000. I propose that we locate the future of independent publishing right here in this continuous trajectory that emerges from the long fight for justice. Let's widen our view to include communal care, potentiality, and liberation beyond the horizon through the distribution and amplification of radical ideas in the public sphere. To follow this trajectory into our present moment, let's pause and step away from our hyper-focused view on exclusive gatekeeping institutions like academic and commercial publishing, art book fairs, the artist's book, book art, and the legacy of artistic publishing in a traditional sense. I propose that we look away from the idea of alternative art world spaces altogether, away from commercial spaces and heteronormative market-based success, and refuse to locate the future of urgent radical publishing in relation to these structures at all. It's a difficult proposal, I'll be the first to admit. We certainly can't blame ourselves for wanting to bring our books and our zines to market and maybe to make a profit. I'm not suggesting that we never sell our work, but to what end? Who profits and how? What does it really mean to participate in the art book fair economy? Is that sustainable? At what cost? Who does this economy favor and serve? Who does it exclude? While admission to printed matters fairs remains free to the public, The application process for exhibitors is extremely competitive. More than 1,000 vendors applied for 350 spots at the last in-person fair, which was 2019. Once accepted, participants paid fees ranging from $150 for a small table in the zine tent to more than $1,200 for premium indoor tables to more than $10,000 for larger project spaces. In 2019, Printed Matter hosted exhibitors from 28 countries and attracted 35,000 visitors in a single weekend. If there was ever a global circuit for independent artistic publishing, this is it, undoubtedly, these art book fairs, especially in terms of audience and potential for sales. Images of crowded art book fairs are used again and again to demonstrate the popularity of zines and artists' books and as evidence of the resurgence of print and physical media. The fairs host a vibrant community of vendors and participants who discover, socialize, and connect. At the same time, and this needs to be said clearly, this is primarily a space of commerce. Unit sales and movement of product are not only desirable, but crucial in order to maintain one's position in the art book fair economy. The art book fair is not separate from the art market. It is an alternative extension of it that requires and depends upon the same activities like branding, marketing, and selling, even if at a different scale. Instead of infiltrating the supermarket, we've set up our own inside a museum. While no one expects to become wealthy selling zines at art book fairs, the pressure to break even in order to recoup what are often tremendous expenses is enormous. There is little room for failure in this model, something many of us know all too well from experience. I see someone in the chat said lost sound. Can everybody hear me? Good, okay. Others can. I hope you find the sound, whoever that was. The year-round scheduling of the fairs establishes a steady seasonal rhythm for artistic publishers that discourages urgent or disruptive acts in favor of planned, well-organized projects that have the potential to sell, marketed and approved well in advance. All of the good energy and support generated by and for the independent publishing community at these events is enormous and undeniable. They've changed my life and my work. Still, the art book fair is a hustle space, often at the expense of mental and physical health, which suffers for many under the enormous pressure to remain visible and viable and to perform successfully at the market. I can't overstate this enough. This is especially true for historically marginalized and minoritized participants who must negotiate enormous issues around visibility and self-care in public space on top of everything else. The hustle space of independent artistic publishing, which is centered firmly on the art book fair, leaves little room for unprofitability, experimentation, or failure. There is only so much tolerance for radicality or disruption here at the art book fair before the economics become untenable. I've already asked you to put aside the two words that have brought us together at this conference, artist and book. It's not because I'm trying to avoid something, but because we desperately need to widen our view. By we, I mean our community of folks who publish, as well as the critics and scholars and students and collectors and anyone else who believes in the power of, as Lepard put it, spreading the word. I'm asking us to shift, maybe uncomfortably so, from taking the temperature of art book criticism and scholarship to considering the future of independent publishing during crisis, against and beyond capitalism. To do this, we desperately need new language. We need new forms of discourse to get at what it means to create and share today. We need to examine images of protest and performance and social media and zines at a conference devoted to the artist's book and connect them to the larger moments of urgent formation I've sketched out, extending from way behind us far into the future. To do so, we need to depart from the familiar. We need to approach this culture of making on other terms, terms that aren't grounded in the values of art world commerce, terms like accumulation, exceptionalism, and individualism. Writer and poet Fred Moten, with Stefana Harney, offers us a way through this. They call for the abolition of both the individual scholar and the lone artist as sovereign figures. They ask us to focus instead on collective work, as Moten puts it, from the I to the we, and the notion of shared practice as a way to satisfy the wealth of communal needs. In a sermon Moten delivered last year, just before the pandemic, he spoke about gathering in call and response as a radical turbulence that has a tendency to overturn the order of things, that must be honored and unleashed and cultivated. He says that, quote, gathering makes a grammar all its own. Evidence of this gathering, this grammar all its own, is vivid and plentiful all around us in our recent periods of deep and overlapping intersecting crises. The evidence is in the urgent radical messages shared in public space, acts of publishing that are far removed from traditional definitions of artistic practice found here at the art book fair or in specialty bookshops, often not looking like publishing at all. Rather, it is the invisible, illegible, or undervalued labor of organizing and activism by historically marginalized people and underserved communities that now fuels a new ethics and politics of urgent collective making. As COVID spread to the US last year in March, and then during the late spring uprisings around racial injustice and the murder of George Floyd, digital platforms like Google Docs, Instagram, and TikTok exploded with urgent acts of writing, organizing, protest, performance, and sharing. Mutual aid spreadsheets, toolkits, petitions, letters, manifestos, live streams, funding directories, testimonial archives, poetry, murals, reading lists, multi-panel narratives, and educational guides flooded and nourished our feeds. Along with printed newspapers, newsletters, zines, memes, pamphlets, handwritten signs, articles of clothing, and risograph prints, we need to acknowledge the power of these urgent artifacts of conflict and liberation, circulating radical messages on behalf of communal aims across all kinds of networks, new and old. Some of these artifacts are made by artists, but also by writers, activists, abolitionists, students, organizers, and community leaders. These urgent acts and artifacts confuse the traditional boundaries between artist, publisher, and audience. Urgent publishing against and beyond 21st century hypercapitalism continues this trajectory against the acceptable and against institutional rules of cooperation. Urgent publishing today is queer, non-cooperative publishing, in that it interferes with and explicitly refuses to play by heteronormative definitions of success. These are some of the small presses and collectives and projects at this year's fair happening as we speak that embody this important work of gathering and call and response, doing the slow work of community building, organizing, and queer, anti-racist, non-cooperative publishing. This year, I think the fair feels different. Overnight, we've set up e-commerce websites and become mail order businesses. But there's a beautiful intimacy to the fair that's taking place right now that I did not quite anticipate. And it has something to do with network culture and networks of support. It reminds me of early internet days, not exactly in a nostalgic way, but very hopeful and of the moment and of the future. There are so many options for navigating this year's fair, and I feel like we're seeing each other and looking out for each other here at the market in the midst of crisis. I'm here with this new, informal, but very intentional community of queer makers that gathers around the nonprofit publishing space that I direct, Queer Archive work here in Providence, Rhode Island, and online. And we've put some of what I'm discussing today into practice with a new publication that we're releasing right now at the fair Queer Matters. Half of the edition is being distributed by the contributors themselves. The other half distributed for free or trade to queer, trans, and BIPOC folks. Institutions, however, pay. Elsewhere, I'm enormously inspired by the work of Binge Press here in Providence, Ocean State Ass, also here in Rhode Island, American Artist, Demian Diniaze. I'm going fast through these, I know, but I'm glad that you all have the link to the slides. Nat Piper, Brown Recluse Zine Distro, Unity Press, Authentic Creations Artistic Apothecary, Nafis White, Bufu By Us For Us, Kenneth Reves, and Indigenous Action Media, among many others. But also, maybe most importantly, we need to acknowledge all of the folks who are gathering, making, and sharing from positions that aren't necessarily in our familiar spaces. These are artists and students and activists you may never hear of, who work and labor and continue to make out of necessity. For them, spreading the word isn't safe. It isn't a choice or a career move, but a matter of survival. Neo-fascism and neoliberalism are consuming everything in their paths, including resistance. The idea that graphic design, book arts, or publishing as artistic practice can be radical is no longer an option. I reject these efforts. Instead, let's create and circulate radical messages and form new kinds of publics far away from traditional institutions of knowledge production and disciplinarity. These messages will be illegible to some. Urgent artifacts are not easily digestible and they resist canons and containers. This 3D scan of the defaced Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond turns a powerful moment of embodied resistance and protest in public space into something else. It's strange to call this OBJ file from June 2020 a publication, but this file, posted to Sketchfab, is a compelling creative act that can be read, downloaded, studied, shared, copied, archived, and spread. It is a powerful act of publishing, an urgent artifact that needs to be studied, protected, and preserved. Why aren't we looking closely at the thousands of contributions to this unlikely, unfamiliar, but timely publication and this digital file that assembles them, and how it circulates on an open source platform in order to better understand how and why we share today? Let's gather as we are right now at this conference and shift from the I to the we, to the communal work of shared practice. We'll find new energy and motivation by stepping away from traditional notions of publishing as an individual artistic practice, away from the market-facing domination of the artist's book as it's evolved during the last 50 years. Let's find hope and inspiration in the messy, slow work of artists' collectives, activists, and organizers working today engaged in the principles of urgent craft. And in the multiple histories of publishing that are still to be written, choosing to focus specifically on those who are left out, those who work outside of art world whiteness, those who devote themselves to making public as an ongoing, urgent formation towards justice and liberation. This is an ethics and a politics of urgent making that I've sketched out. And this is our call to shape, evolve, share, and manifest these ideas within our everyday work. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. This has been an extraordinary talk.
Thank you.
Very, very much. We have a number of questions that have come through on the chat. And so I wanted to ask you them. First, we'll start with Dave, who's a part of our committee and has asked a number of questions, but I'm going to stick to his last question. You talk about the need for a new language in talking about independent publishing and its opposition to capitalism. Can you expand a bit on what you think that language needs to be able to do and express, process, community, different types of objects, success, etc.?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I feel like that's what many of us are trying to figure out right now. I don't have any solid answers. I have like loose, liquid answers. I can mention, well, the earlier talk where Clara Belliger was speaking for Hardworking, Good Looking. It was taking place in the classroom. They spoke, along with Christian Henson and Dante Carlos, about releasing a particular project where they decided, they made the conscious decision, it had gotten funding from, I think in the Netherlands. And they made a decision to not monetize the project. And I heard that, I didn't know that story from them. And it ricocheted around with an idea that we've been discussing for months at Queer Archive Work about how to release our current publication. It's the one that's behind me on the screen. And we said, what would be queer? How could we release this in a queer way at the Art Book Fair? How can we somehow push against this idea of selling, which is so basic? I mean, so basic that we take it for granted in an environment like the Art Book Fair. And we really struggled with this. There are no easy answers here. And we talked about various scenarios about how it might be free. What do we make if we're making something for free? We ended up getting a grant from the city of Providence. We then had an anonymous donor match that grant. So we had some funds, and we decided that we were going to give the publication away to queer and trans and BIPOC folks, and or offer it for trade, but that institutions would have to pay, and it's for sale for $45. So, like I said, this is not a solid answer. It's like, this is something that I'm doing now for the first time, exploring and experimenting with these ideas with our community. But I'm so inspired and excited to hear that others are experimenting with these ideas. Some of the other publishing projects that I mentioned in the talk. Wow, there's a lot happening in the chat.
There's a lot happening in the chat, so I want to get to some of these questions,
yeah,
including some questions that are coming from the Printed Matter chat Zoom versus this Zoom. So I want to bring some of those in as well. One is, how is activism generally assessed by its impact and outcomes? What is success in activism?
Wow, I wish I knew. No, I mean, it's an amazing question. It's not, maybe not one that we can solve with publishing, you know, but I think, how can we define the success of activism? Well, look, I mean, the jacket that I showed, David Wojnarowicz's jacket.
It was an extremely powerful, I mean, I'd never seen that image. It's incredibly powerful.
Oh yeah. It's amazing. And I've you know, written about it a bit before, but this is, I feel like today in this context, it's actually making the most sense. So I think that's a great example. I mean, at that moment, like, put yourself back to October 1988 and the artist there in that jacket at that action. What kind of impact is being had there in that moment? Some, but it's local, it's whoever was there, this is pre-internet, etc. But that one image has traveled over 30 years to us today. And whether we know it or not, it's informing the way we react to emergency, urgent conditions now in the face of another pandemic. It's inspiring. It's informing the discussion. I mean, I guess I am by putting it here, you know, in a context like this, but others have as well. So what kind of impact? It's really tricky, because I think sometimes, you know, sometimes I show up at an actual, you know, like physical protest and feel like, what impact is this really having? And then you remember, or I'm encouraging us to remember, to remind myself that these are not isolated acts, you know, and that's my whole point in the talk about a continuous urgent formation that's happening. And that's not going to happen unless we do that work to make those connections, to look at what was happening with the Black Panther newspaper and with Barbara Smith. And, you know, those are 3 or 4 examples I mentioned. There's many, hundreds.
Right. Let's go to a question from Megan. What is the role of the critic in the reframing? It is in this discomfort. It came, I think, around the time, I have to remember exactly which slides were being presented at that time, but I think you were ending about the book fair itself, and you were talking about the new language, the non-linearity, birth, me, image. I think it came around that time.
Mm-hmm. I think Megan actually answered it herself in the chat. Making connections. Perhaps this is how the role of the critic to move from artist book critic to urgent public. Yes, yeah. I mean, for me, that's it. And hi, Megan. Megan, do you wanna like unmute and ask the question? It would be fun to have you in the discussion.
Yeah, let's see whether Karina can get her to unmute.
Oh, don't think you can. Okay. All right. Well, that's all right.
Okay.
Yeah, I think. Okay, so there's a larger question here that I think is that Megan's question is connected to. Mm-hmm. It's referencing, which is who has power. You know, who has power in these conversations? So we can look at the critics, we can look at the curators, we can look at the educators, we can look at people who run nonprofits and other kinds of institutions.
Sure.
And hi, Megan, you're unmuted.
Hi, Megan.
So I want to connect your question to who speaks and writes and does their work from a position of power and has the ability to maybe make connections or provide access or go to new audiences in ways that where there's some kind of responsibility or accountability, I think. That's why I'm doing this talk at this conference.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. And really, can you hear me? Can you guys hear me okay?
Very well.
Yeah, I think that's so well said and really connects so much to the larger topics of this whole conference. Later this afternoon, there's actually going to be another session. I dropped the info in the chat where we're going to be having small group conversations about the role of the critic in talking about activist material as a form of artist books and also publishing as artistic practice. And everything you're talking about is something that I think about a lot as a critic and what my responsibility is to be that bridge, but also to not speak on behalf of the community whose work I'm trying to elucidate and how to walk that line very carefully.
Yep, exactly. No, and I totally agree. And that's also why I have a call in here for new language. You know, we need new forms of discourse. And, you know, the whole thing that you've been doing around, you know, a new kind of artist's book criticism, I think is desperately needed. You know, like that is exactly what we need right now, because it's not, and I hope no one misunderstands from the talk, it's not that I don't value the work of Ed Ruscha and Seth Siegelab and the printed matter origin story. I'm in love with all of that work. It's because of that actually that I want to put it aside, because it's distracted me for many years, you know, like where that all came from and how our attention, our collective attention is so focused on a certain group of legacy white art world establishment, whether you're talking about the gallery system or painting or artists' books. You know, I think it's all connected.
And this notion of expanding publishing and the idea of artist books to include the kinds of projects you're talking about, these urgent instances of publishing, allows us to bring more people into this legacy that have actually been there all along and been left out.
Exactly. Yeah. And I don't want to ever appear to be, you know, I hope I'm not like, hey, I'm discovering this, you know, this stuff's been happening. People have written about it. There is discourse there. I just know that sometimes we find ourselves in venues where maybe it's less known or it's actually been left out.
Thanks so much for inviting me in.
No, thank
Thanks for
you.
coming. We're going to go on to the next question now from Deborah. What kind of platforms do you suggest for more collaborative connections between publishers, artists, etc., whose interests are related to spreading the word in okay, this is a tongue twister for me, but non-heteronormative places, sorry.
That's it.
That's it. How would you suggest for this to be done to people introducing themselves recently to this world?
Yeah. Oh, great question. And I'm glad that someone's even asking that question. So the easy answer, the kind of like quick and easy answer, is just use whatever you have access to, use whatever's around. But I want to get a little bit more into this because, when the pandemic hit and quarantine happened and suddenly we're all remote, I had just launched Queer Archive Work as a nonprofit and was about to start an artist residency program, wasn't quite sure how I was going to do that in the pandemic. And long story short, we ended up, besides starting the artist residency program, bringing together a much larger community of folks and people online in order to just meet. At first, it was just like, let's hang out. Let's just hang out and have a place to connect and chat without any kind of goal. And I think that's part of this. I think no matter what platform you're using, if you want to talk about resisting heteronormative definitions of success, those definitions are almost always based on wealth and accumulation. What can we make? What can that product be that we make so that we can sell it, so we can collect it, so we can show it off and market it, et cetera. So it's not that we never need to do those things, but what happens if you make space to not do those things? What happens if you call a meeting on Zoom with your loose community of queer artists without any agenda? What if no one's actually leading the meeting, And so I'm sure some of you are thinking like, that's chaos, it'll be a mess. And that's part of it also, is like getting comfortable with messy situations. So we can talk about mess in terms of like protest and political action and things like that. But we can also talk about mess in terms of like, let's get a little uncomfortable with where are we going with this meeting and who has something to say that maybe feels like they can say it now. So I guess all of that is to say that some of the platforms and tools that I was initially most resistant to when quarantine hit, like Zoom and other collaborative, like places to do collaborative work online, like Google Docs, have now become like essential and crucial for us. And we can get into the whole platform politics of like who Google is and why do we use their tools. But my take on that is like, let's just use what's available and be aware of those politics.
Sure. There is an interesting question on the Zoom on the Zoom chat from Printed Matter that's being, I think, answered in real time in the chat, which we can address for sure. I have a few other questions, and we have about 20 minutes left in the session.
Sure.
So I'll ask one other question here, and then maybe we can address this one as well. Christy George asks, I'm struggling to understand non-cooperative in this context. Any help?
Okay. Non-cooperative. Okay. So I want to mention that word specifically is something that I heard. I mentioned Fred Moten and Stefano Harney. They gave a talk a couple of months ago online, of course, and it was about abolition. It was about how to work in academia. It was about resistance in all sorts of ways. But at some point, Stefano Harney brought up the topic of publishing, and specifically non-cooperative publishing. He was referring to it in relation to peer review and academic journals. He was talking about it in relation to academic publishing, where there's this like drive, these requirements to publish and to subject whatever it is that you're making to peer review. And his call, and it was really kind of extreme in the moment, it was beautiful, was let's just put all that shit online. Those were his words, for free. I think he used those words as well. And maybe that doesn't sound so radical here in this context, but in the context of academic publishing and tenure and what it means to be part of an institution where publishing and playing according to the rules is so important, the idea that you bypass all of that and you don't deal with the journal, you don't deal with the institution that's sponsoring that journal, and you just say, I'm putting this work here online for free to be accessed. That's his definition of non-cooperative publishing, and I really embrace that. And I think, we could go a lot further with that word and talk about other ways that you can refuse, you can resist, refuse, you can yeah, anyway, but I think that's where I got
Right.
the word from.
Well, Christy says, thanks for explaining. So
Good.
the initial question that seems to be an interesting conversation going on here through the Printed Matter Zoom chat is how do you reconcile your stance with the conditions that make your practice possible, specifically your position in academia? And somebody responded to the questions saying, I'm looking here, how to reconcile one's affiliation versus academia. Change happens from within more effectively than without. Then when it comes to academia, people like Paul make tangible change within these institutions in a hugely effective way. The conversation shifts. So thank goodness for protests from within. And so the point is agreed, but isn't that a form of infiltration? I'd love you to comment on this.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. And thanks, Lucy, and whoever asked the original question. This is also something that I don't have a solid answer for, but Lucy gets at it. I think I'm constantly struggling with this, honestly. So I think acting within an institution and trying, towards reform of the institution, whether it be a school or a government agency or a corporation or whatever, versus pulling out and leaving, really sort of leaving the master's house, like not using the tools in order to take down the house, but actually going to build a new one. Currently, I'm doing both. So I'm able to do something like queer archive work because I'm fully employed, benefits, all of that at Rhode Island School of Design. So, I'm in academia and that supports me and I enjoy it. I love it. But I also know that a lot of the questions that we're asking at Queer Archive work and the work that we're doing, it would be different if I tried to do that within the school. So I'm not leaving either. I'm trying to do both. And I'll get back to you on that and see where I am.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Megan's last point is also very, and you bring up, it's such an important question in the art world in general, with artists in general, because we do live in a world now where, as my mother always says to me, when she moved here in the 70s, you could have $10 in your pocket and make something of yourself. And now it's like, it's impossible. And here, meaning New York City. And there is that question of how do artists survive? And I know this is a larger topic, and we talk about it from a real estate perspective. We talk about it from just people moving out of New York, and then all of a sudden we're out of artists. Like we're not surrounded by artists anymore, which is not necessarily the case, but is becoming more and more the case. How do artists survive today? That is the biggest question. Anyway, I don't know that we have enough time to really deep into that question right now, but it is a very important question, and it is the number of artists that I know who also have academic positions, yet because they need that stability, they need to be able to have that ability to pay the rent at the end of the day, and also have the time to be able to create their art. I mean, you're obviously not alone in this, in that. Christy says, one contradiction I'm struggling with is that I find the agenda-less, leader-less meeting that Paul described as really appealing and compelling. But what I've observed in practice is that beyond the chaos, structureless context often privilege people who have positional power feel like they should speak, have something to say. Whereas new people often feel safer when the rules of engagement are clearly defined and understood. Have you had a different experience?
No, that's a really great point, Christy. I've had that experience, absolutely. I guess what I could say to that is that I think it's crucial when you find yourself in a position of power, trying to experiment with an idea like this. By power, I'm saying, I'm a cisgendered male, white, queer person who's a full-time professor at a really good institution. So yes, I'm coming into a meeting or a space at Queer Archive work from a position of power. I don't think this all works unless you bring that kind of awareness into it. And I also don't think that simply having awareness is enough. You do have to adjust the rules and adjust yourself and make that space that's going to allow someone who maybe is looking for some of those guidelines or those rules of engagement more comfortable. And honestly, I'm still just experimenting with this, and I'm grateful that I have this, that I'm doing this work with this incredible group of people who gather as we do at Queer Cut Work. You know, sometimes it's a couple of people, sometimes we're 15 people on these weekly Zoom calls that we have, where we just make stuff together and we chat and we have a lot of fun. But you know, it's something that I'm constantly thinking about. And you know, I get really scared when I think about someone from a position of power trying to do this without that kind of awareness. And I'm trying to hold myself accountable to that, and also being open and transparent about it with others in the community, so that you can be held accountable and understand when is it that I should not be making decisions.
Great. There's another question now from Nora.
Hi, Nora.
Hi, Nora. It's my mother's name too. It's a great name. Thank you for the generous talk, Paul. This is a question about language and your call to expand recognition of language that is being widely distributed as creative interventions, as with the monument. I particularly appreciate the call to expand definitions of language that is critical and urgent. How do many of us in the artist critic art publishing vortex learn to recognize what urgent critical language that we have blind spots about? How do you recognize or grapple with your own and what doesn't sound like the critical because of our training preferences?
Wow.
Yeah.
What a great question. Thank you, Nora. Yeah. How do we learn to recognize what urgent critical language that we have blind spots about? Well, I think by doing and discussing and not hiding with the language. You know, I guess that's, what do I mean by that? I mean, this is something obviously that I would love to talk about more with you, Nora, but with others as well, is the notion of the blind spot. I mean, I'm constantly thinking about it. I guess I'm saying that I'm wondering if it has something to do with the openness and the transparency and the constant discussion and conversation, and creating those kinds of situations in order to, maybe with even like the goal or the purpose of testing things out, of holding yourself accountable, of trying things out. Doing a talk like this, for instance, and then being able to converse and have discourse around it afterwards. I mean, I want to know about my blind spots, and that's only going to happen if I do risky things like do a talk in public and try out new ideas. So I guess that's it. I mean, I know you and others who do that, who go into public situations or, you know, semi-public situations in order to try language out. And I think that's what we do. That is, again, I think kind of a role of an educator or a critic or someone who's engaged in discourse with others. But anyway, I want to talk about that more.
Yeah. And to Megan's point, it's all about listening. Listening is the key.
Yeah.
Listening,
yeah. And someone else just
wanting to respond to it. There is, and then the blind spot is really a point because we all have one and it's different for everyone. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
We really need to be aware of that. Last, we still have a little more time. Another question coming from Gender Fail. I really want us to challenge the idea that there is no money in books, and rather think how artists, bookmakers who do not have funding can make money with this work. That'd be great. There is so much ableism in this hustle of having a day job and also having the time, energy, ability to do both. Can we find ways to think about making money that benefits those who need it most? What could those resources to help those who do not have resources, who do not have the CVs to get grant funded?
Yeah.
Also in an era of, digitization and, all of that too, is that question as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's key. Hi, B. Thanks for such a great question. Again, I think it's something that we need to just keep working on. What are these ways that we can redistribute the wealth? And that wealth could be actual money. The wealth could be access to resources, the wealth of being in a position of having access to something and having access to something that's powerful. And so I think the heat is on. The responsibility is on those of us who are able to hustle, juggle, do whatever it is, and to make sure that those resources are being redirected, creating spaces that take down this idea that accumulation is key to success. And generosity is a big part of that. I know that doesn't really answer your question, because how does, you're asking like, how does one actually, how did you put it, challenge the idea that there is no money in books? I mean, I know, I see the work that you do. I mean, you are the hardest working person there is when it comes to making and getting it out there and doing that hustle. And it's incredible to watch, but I also know what's involved, the risks and the labor and the exhaustion and it's the precarity of all of that. Yeah. I wish I had a better answer to that, except that, mutual aid publishing, which is something that obviously I'm interested in and I'm trying out here for the first time, in the language that I'm trying to give to that. There's something in there in that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, to that point where this is a societal issue where, hard work doesn't equal success anymore necessarily. Not that hard work can't lead to success and doesn't lead to success and people aren't working hard to be successful. But, in the artist space, for example, it's very hard to be successful in the traditional way, in the societal way of success, meaning being able to afford things, be able to earn a living, etc. A lot of artists work very, very hard and they don't actually have that same success. And so the question is, it's not only in the book space that we're in now, but it's in the artist world in general. In the dance world, it's just as bad.
In which world? Which world?
In the world of dance, dancers who are paid pennies, the work that they do.
Well, it's the problem of capitalism, which is that the work and the end result and the profit, those things are not aligned, and that situation's getting worse.
Yeah, it's also the problem of a society that doesn't value art in the same way.
Right.
If we compare,
which compounds that.
Back in the day, if you would compare the budget of European budgets for culture and American budgets for culture, NEA versus Ministry of Cultures, that's a whole other conversation. Trying to see if there's any other questions. Does anybody else have any other questions?
I'm sure we missed some.
I have some early on questions. I have one. The first question we got in the chat was from Dave Solo. He'd be interested to hear more about what you think about institutionalization of artist books referred to by A.A. Bronson means and implies, and also how this balances with getting work out to a wider audience.
Well, again, like with every question that's come up so far, I don't feel like there's any clear-cut answer. It's more gray than that. It's more ambiguous, because I do believe that there can be tremendous value in an institution helping to get the word out. I think we need to do that, and with criticality. I think we need to do that with transparency and awareness of what the politics of that institution are, whether you're using Google Docs, and you're questioning, like, who is this company that I'm pouring all my content into and sharing with other people, or if it's the school that you teach at, or whatever that institute, or the institution that's housing, the art book fair that you happen to be showing up to sell at. Every one of these examples and countless others are moments where you find yourself in alignment or not in alignment with a situation. I'm here, I'm using their space, I'm using their tool, I'm engaging with their people, or I am one of their people, and so it goes back to that earlier question of doing that work within or outside of and without the institution. And I challenge anyone to come up with a very clear-cut answer to that, because I have found that when there's this extreme response, like I reject all institutions, I'm just going to go build my own house, or I'm just going to reform and forget everything else that's happening outside these walls, that those tend to set up other kinds of blind spots, actually.
Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong buttons. We have a couple comments from Megan, also interesting to think about who has the power in institutions as keepers of history.
Yeah.
So problematic
Archives.
in history as they keep. Urgent publishing, in the way Paul describes, is very anti-hierarchical, but yet to achieve what we hope to achieve is expanding critically. We must find a way to bring these into archives, into the history, which in some ways requires an institution, which is so slippery. And that's true.
Yeah,
it's very true. I think we're going to almost wrap it up. Maybe one last question, again from Dave early on in the chat. To what extent should urgent or activist publishing be assessed by its impact and outcomes? I think we've sort of touched on that already.
I think we touched on that. Yeah. I mean, again, part of me wants to resist this idea that, like, everything that we make and put out there has to have this commodifiable, clear result that we're going to get back. Like, what's the payoff? It's it's undeniable, but that's part of it always. Where institutions are buying our new publication, and I'm giving little updates on Slack to the group, like, here's how much money has come in. So is that impact, or are we more interested in the more than twice the amount of people who have requested free or traded copies of this, and what kind of impact that might have? That's not an impact that I'm going to be able to quantify or measure. There are no metrics for that, except maybe the health of the community, that as it continues to grow.
Sure. Well, I think we're getting to the end of this talk. This has been fascinating and amazing. And thank you so much. And it's such a pleasure to meet you, and it's such a pleasure to do this with you. Thank you for participating.
Likewise, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. Thank you for participating in the chat. I wish I could keep a copy of all the comments that were made. Zoom should really make a way to archive everything. Thank you to all of our sponsors. The next session is at 3:30. Please join us. Please we've put in a few times a link to Paul's website and to the presentation. Please copy that and read it further as you'd like. And you can get a copy of the chat by emailing devin@centerforartcrits.org if you'd like. And that's it. We're going to be leaving the room open for the next 15 minutes. And we'll be unmuting everybody. And if you guys want to have sort of virtual conversations together, chat a little bit, please go ahead and do so. Thank you, everybody, very, very much. And thank you, Paul.
Bye.
Hey, guys.
Thank you.